Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round 18 coverage of the Zurich 1953 Candidates Tournament. From round 18, I selected the game Smyslov versus Euwe. I've given little biographies of them in earlier videos, so I'll just say that Smyslov with the white pieces is a future world champion, and Euwe with the black pieces is a former world champion, although playing quite well in this tournament. They start off with knight f3. Smyslov starts off with knight f3, and Euwe replies knight f6, so both kind of non-committal moves, waiting to see how the other side develops. And Smyslov continues with the kingside fianchetto. And I have noticed in Smyslov's games that he likes to fianchetto his kingside bishop. In fact, there's even a line in the Ruy Lopez named after Smyslov where black fianchettos his kingside bishop in the Ruy Lopez. Anyway, this is the Reti opening with d5 and continues with bishop g2. And now bishop f5 was played. I think c5 is a move in the Reti, but Smyslov has different ideas. He's just going to castle kingside, knight bd7, and set up this very modest pawn structure, just pawns on the first and second and third ranks, and allow white or black to do pretty much whatever he wants in the center. So black sets up a solid formation as well, knight bd2. And then h6. So h6 is a move that has been criticized by Bronstein. He thought, well, first of all, let me point out the advantage of h6 is that if the knight comes over here to harass the bishop can drop back to this hole on h7. So I think it makes a lot of sense to play the move h6. And it's not like it's a really bad move. It's just that Bronstein thinks it might be more appropriate here to play the move, not that one, e5 here, just grabbing more space in the center that's supported by the knight. So, and white hasn't done anything to stop black from grabbing that kind of space, and I think black would have an easier game after a move like that. The chess engine also is pointing out that e6 is a possibility here, just setting up that pawn triangle. Anyway, that was not played. h6 was played, and instead of going after this harass the bishop line, which doesn't lead to much anymore after knight h4, the bishop would just drop back to h7. Smyslov comes up with a really interesting idea. It's a pawn sacrifice. It's the move e4, and yeah, it's just giving up a center pawn. And it's not, well, Bronstein doesn't say in his book if this was the product of opening preparation or if he came up with this over the board. But it's a pretty interesting pawn sack. It's entirely valid, at least as far as the chess engine is concerned. It thinks that white has more than enough compensation here. So black picks up the pawn, and he's got an extra pawn in the center. He's got this e-pawn. But his development is lagging. He's got to develop his bishop and castle. And white has open lines. Both sides have the bishop pair, so really this is just a pure pawn sacrifice. There's no material compensation. It's just open lines and development of his pieces. So interesting. And white stays material down for quite a long time in this game. So from this point, being a pawn down, he's not in a hurry to get it back, but he is trying to get his pieces to good squares. He starts off with this knight d4 move, harassing the bishop on f4. Now it is possible to play the move knight d6 here, and that's actually the recommendation of Bronstein and also the chess engine. Now the idea with knight d6 is just to say, okay, you want the bishop pair, I will give you the bishop pair, and at least I will have a little bit easier job of development. I'll get rid of one of your developed pieces. And this game is about even, but black chose to play instead knight takes d2. This makes sense as well, getting rid of the other knight and keeping the bishop pair. So bishop takes d2, getting the piece back, and now this bishop just drops back to h7 in that hole that was prepared by the move h6. So black's got his bishop pair, he's got an extra pawn, and he's just a little bit behind in development. So it's interesting that white still in this position has more than enough compensation for the pawn. So bishop to c3 puts the bishop on a good diagonal, and maybe indirectly makes it a little more difficult for black to develop if he has to worry about the g7 pawn here. There was a suggestion here. Yeah, let's go over this. Bronstein had a kind of a crazy idea here, so I thought I would show you. He thought already that White's lead was so large that he could consider sacrificing a piece here with knight takes c6. And actually, the chess engine is not too impressed with this idea. It thinks black is probably better with best play here. But well, you know, it's he's got his bishops out. He's got open lines, and it's a bit tricky. Bishop to f5 here is probably the best defense. Bring the bishop out and defend the knight this way. So if there's an exchange, and now rook to e1, developing. And the game would continue. Rook to c8. Requires some precise moves, but it looks like black can hold this position and come out with a slight edge. So the sacrifice is interesting, but not totally correct. Anyway, Smyslov played the more reasonable move, bishop to c3. The chess engine prefers the move rook to e1 immediately as the best way to keep the advantage, and that makes a lot of sense. Just looking at the position, you know, put your rook on the open square. But anyway, bishop c3 was the game, and now it's about even. For a while there, White had a definite edge, even being down a pawn. But now he's down a pawn, and he has just compensation. The game is pretty equal about here. Queen c7. Queen f3. So getting his pieces out, and now e5 is played, kicking the knight. The rook goes to e1, so he doesn't have to move the knight right away. He pins the pawn first, and this is one thing I've noticed. You might think about this in your own games a bit, but it's very frequent in high-level play that when one of their pieces is threatened, or they find some way to deal with it other than moving the piece a lot of times, or they'll move it to an unexpected square. But this is, I think, the mark of a strong player is he finds ways to develop his pieces in spite of the harassment of his opponent's moves. So black castles queenside here to get out of the pin. Now the knight goes to b3 and f6, and Black has consolidated. He's still a pawn up, and now he's got a pretty solid structure. He's managed to castle, and so somehow that advantage maybe that White had from the initiative from the pawn sacrifice seems to be slipping away a bit. But there is a hidden weakness in this f6 move. Creates a solid center here, but does create some openings on the light squares, which are exploited later. So if we back up, Bronstein recommended actually the move f5 right away, just taking that, putting this pawn on a good square, taking more space in the center, and preventing some of these ideas of light square attacks. So the chess engine actually rates both of those moves as about even. So we'll just see how the game goes. f6 was played, and bishop a5 now, starting to poke at some of these weaknesses, trying to create some new weaknesses in the black camp. And actually the best defense here is probably the move b6. Black Euwe he was reluctant to create more pawn weaknesses. That's putting another pawn on a dark square may end up with a shut-in bishop or a weak c-pawn. So he tried to play the move knight to b6, but now there's this uncomfortable pin. So actually, in this position, it would have been slightly better to play the move b6 over knight b6. And now White is back in the driver's seat. So he has the compensation for the pawn again. It just shows how close this position is at that pawn advantage. Seems to kind of come and go, but it's still there at the moment that White has compensation for the pawn. So he plays c4, a very active move, threatening immediately c5, hitting the knight. So rook d3 was played, counterattacking the queen. Another example of not responding immediately to a threat, but trying to get your pieces active. Queen goes over to h5, looking at some of these light squares. And now the queen moves to e7. Cancel that. e7. And so he's unpinned the knight, but he is allowing some damage to his pawn structure, which is not played immediately. White first plays the move bishop to f1. Now it may be a little more accurate right here to play bishop h3 immediately. The king is in kind of an awkward spot. So the game might go bishop h3 check, king b8, and knight c5. Pretty interesting idea with knight c5. The queen can't actually take the knight because of the threat of invasion here. For example, queen takes, queen e8 check, and notice the bishop is also coming in on the light square. So we have a good example of these light squared weaknesses coming in. There's actually a mate in 3 in this position if you want to pause the video and see if you can figure it out. It's not too hard. There's only one move for the king. Well, he can throw some pieces in the way like rook d8 or knight to c8, but those just get taken. So the king goes to f7 or c7, and then it's queen c8 check, supported by the bishop. King only has one move here, and then it's queen d8 check. And now there's nowhere for the king to run. All of his escape squares are taken. The queen's guarding all of these squares. The bishop and the pawn are guarding all of these squares. All they can do is throw the knight in between, and then you take the knight. So pretty interesting tactic there with knight c5 after bishop h3 check. Okay, so that was not played, though. He played bishop f1, harassing the rook. The rook doesn't want to drop back immediately. It doesn't really have any good squares. If it goes, well, so all these squares are under attack. If it goes here, there's a pin. If it goes here, there's a pin on the knight that can be taken advantage of. And if it goes to d7, let's see, there was a problem with that too. Rook to d7, then bishop to h3. Now, yeah, there's this the pin in this direction, right? So everywhere the rook goes on the d file, there's problems. So he can't move the rook right away. So he throws in the move g6. So the queen goes to e2. He didn't really want to play that move g6. It's created some more weaknesses over here. And now the rook can go to d7 because after bishop h7 he can block with the f pawn. So queen to e3 was played, just some maneuvering with the queen, also maybe with ideas of taking here and winning a pawn, finally balancing out the material. King to b8 was played, and white decides to stay a pawn down. He doesn't grab the pawn back here, but he keeps developing with rook a to d1. So pretty, I think, also a very instructive example of how to play when you're down a pawn. Sometimes you want to get the pawn back right away, but sometimes you're playing for the compensation. If you have good active moves that you can make to keep the pressure up, it's better to play those. Anyway, knight to c8 was played here. And now black starts to get into trouble. So a slightly better try here was bishop to g8, just allowing whatever pawn damage might occur over here. Bishop takes, queen takes, and just trying to hold on in this position. And maybe with bishop e6, the engine is suggesting that black can hold this, and it should be about even. White's gotten his pawn back, but nothing more. Anyway, so knight to c8 was a bit of a mistake. And now bishop to h3 comes. So this move has been in the air for a while. We've talked about it a few times. And he can't block. This is interesting. He wants to play f4, but he can't play it right away. If you play f4 immediately, there's a real weakness on e5. This is a problem here. So rook takes, queen takes, and then you can just grab here with check. And the rook in the corner is gone. So that's not working at all. So he trades rooks first. Rook takes. Rook takes. And now f5, blocking out the bishop. But he has created a weakness. His pawn on e5 is now weak. So bishop to b4. hitting the queen. Another nice trick. The queen can't leave its post here, defending the e-pawn. If let's see, well, I'll go ahead and put it on the board. Once again, if the queen takes bishop, then you have queen takes e5 check, and it's a fork picking up the rook in the corner. So what's the move here? The move that black played was queen f6. It's not the most stubborn defense, and the game goes downhill from that point. So maybe the best way to play, the chess engine is suggesting there's two moves that could be tried here, queen c7 or queen e8. So queen e8, holding on to the bishop here, which is under attack. And then bishop to c3 is interesting, just pinning this e-pawn, and looks like white just has a lot of pressure. White will get the pawn back for sure in this case, and he has a nice attack going. So that's one way to play it. It's good for white. The other way is the queen going to c7, allowing this trade. And the problem with the trade is actually it dropped the h-pawn, so now this is loose. But even more than that, now the knight can come into c5 with the threat of coming to d6 and forking the knight, the rook and the queen. And so once again, white rather is getting his pawn back, and he's got really active pieces that are attacking. So strong advantage to white in both of those lines. But so queen f6, I guess even though it was not the best move, all the moves lead to an advantage for white. So and a difficult choice to choose the lesser of the various evils. So now bishop to c3, and you can see why queen f6 had some problems. Got a very dangerous looking diagonal with the queen and the rook piled up on it. Bishop to g7 was played, just trying to hold on to this e-pawn by force. And now the bishop has moved away. The knight can come into c5, threatening a fork on d7 there, hitting the queen and the king. So this is a threat that has to be dealt with immediately. King a8 was played. And now knight takes b7, a very nice sacrifice. So white, could have gotten his pawn back at various points. He could have even gotten it back there, but instead of getting his pawn back, he sacrifices another piece with knight takes b7. So I don't know what Euwe was thinking at this point. He may be thinking, is this really good? He went ahead and took the knight. And in fact, taking the knight is the best move, but white is winning after this. There's rook d7 check. So if we count the pieces, white is down a whole piece. There's an extra knight here. Pawns are now even. But just the activity of white's pieces is enough to make the difference. The king runs away to a8, and now he invades with queen c5. So there is a really nice line here, an alternate line with bishop g2, just to show the dangers of this position and the problems that black has. So if white plays bishop g2, threatening to take here, and that actually will lead to mate. It's defended by the queen at the moment. Actually, that might have been the idea of queen c5 too, as to build up the attack on the c6 pawn. But immediately going after c6 here, rook to d8, trying to counterattack the rook and chase it away. Bishop takes e5, hitting the queen. And now if the queen takes, then bishop takes c6 leads to a mate in 2. So if you want to see if you can find the mate in 2, pause the video. Yeah, pretty straightforward. There's only one move for the king, and then the rook comes over here. There's only one move for the king, and then any square that the rook retreats to is going to be mate. So that's all over there. So this is a very dangerous position. After bishop g2, rook d8, bishop takes e5, queen takes e5 is the move. Is the losing move, but to continue, he would have to take the rook and give up the queen. So not very good. Anyway, another line was chosen by white. He played queen c5 first, with the idea of later ganging up on the c pawn. Notice that the e pawn is still pinned. So when the bishop comes to g2, he can never play the move pawn to e4, blocking that diagonal. So after queen c5, black tried knight b6, hitting the rook. And now the rook just takes the bishop. So he sacrifices the exchange. Queen takes, and now he's a whole rook down. But the material is starting to come back pretty fast. So starting with this move, bishop takes e5. So now there's no longer any idea the pawn could move forward to e4 and block this diagonal. So he can grab this diagonal anytime he wants. And it's just a really interesting position. It's a queen and two bishops against a queen, two minor pieces, and a rook. So a whole rook down. And he's gotten his pawn back now, at least. He's a pawn up, actually. But the whole rook down. So the queen has to move. And in fact, there is a mate threat here. If the queen goes anywhere that defends the rook, for example, queen here, then just queen takes c6 is checkmate. The two pieces on the diagonal cover all the squares of the king, so it's just game over. So the only move here to hold on is actually some move that protects the c-pawn. And now that just gives up the rook in the corner. So in this position, what's the situation? White is a pawn up, and he has the bishop pair. And black's king is still somewhat suspect. But from here on out, it's really just a technical win. So the rest of the game is not as interesting. But I will play through it just so you can see the moves. And there's a few points you can talk about the grandmaster technique. How do you win a technically won game? So anyway, the king comes out to defend the pawn. He retreat the bishop back. And there's just some maneuvering with the pieces. He's going to protect his pawns here, make sure he doesn't give up any pawns. f4, trying to create some counterplay over here on the king side. And White is just ignoring this, but moving his pawns forward. He's got the extra pawn over here on the king side, and he's going to just win with that in the long run. And after a few more moves, this a6 move, chasing the knight away from a defensive position here. a5, knight c8. And the immediate a6 is interesting here. Actually, black can't take the pawn because if a6, king takes, then queen b4 is got too many threats to deal with. There's this a mate threat, basically, if you push this pawn forward. So he has to give up material here to deal with that. So that would have been a quicker way to finish it. He played bishop g2. This is actually move 39, so he probably didn't want to pause and stop to calculate any lengthy variations at this point. The time control is at move 40, so he's probably playing a few moves that he thought would just be safe and keep his advantage, which you see a lot. And so now he throws in the check, grabs a pawn, and allows the queen trade. And we get into this endgame with he's got the bishop pair and he's got an extra pawn. And it's a pretty straightforward win. He brings this king to the center to help his pawns promote. And the biggest problem you have in this endgame is that you have to watch out for the knight and all the little tricks. There's always these threats of the knight hopping in here and forking things. So you have to play this carefully and slowly. He's just maneuvering his pieces around. Cancel that. Oh, there was a funny move here. King a5 was played here, giving up the a pawn. But if the king goes to a6, you can see the point of white centralizing his king. He can walk his king over here. And now black's king is completely shut up. The bishops are covering all these squares. And if they, well, actually, move suggested is this, but if the king were to come up, the white king can come to the c3 square anyway. And so the black king is in a box. It can never get out of these squares. It can only go back and forth. And then the bishops can roam the board attacking these pawns. So knight b6 is a sample continuation. f4 takes. I mean, it's a bit of an accomplishment for black to get rid of pawns. If you can get rid of all the pawns, it's a draw, of course. But if white stays a pawn up and manages to queen, then it's a win. Knight d7, g4, knight b8. Cancel that. Knight b8. Knight g8 is no good. And bishop here. And now he's picking up another pawn. And you can see the advantages of the bishops kind of controlling the board and keeping his king out of play. That's doing both jobs pretty well. So that's why he played the somewhat funny move, king to a5, just giving up the a pawn. But now white is 2 pawns up, and he gets some activity with this king. That was in compensation, rather than going down the other line where his king was confined and the white bishops were allowed to roam the board and pick up pieces at will. Now he's got an active king, and he tries to get counterplay. If he can round up enough of those pawns, again, he has drawing hopes. So again, there's some more moves here. He's making progress. He's keeping the white pawns back, and so if they come forward, they'll have to be traded off. But white is managing to hold on to everything, and eventually he's going to arrange his pieces in a way that he can start moving them forward. And that's what happened here. He used his king to chase to gain a tempo on the bishop, and he moved his pawn forward. He gave up on this c pawn. He could no longer defend it. And now he's using his bishops to try and control the squares the knight can go to. And at last, black finally manages to win one of the pieces, but now, or force a trade of one of the pieces, which it's another thing that black would prefer to trade pawns rather than pieces. So this is now white has 2 passed pawns, but black has hopes of getting counterplay over here on the king side, I guess. King b4, going after the bishop, and now he can pick up this pawn, but he decides to push on with h4 here. Takes. King takes c5, and now white pushes forward with the h-pawn. And he plays g3 to distract the king. This is an important point. He needs to pull the king away. This pawn is just going to queen. His king is too far away to stop it, and his bishop needs to get to this square and to stop the pawn from queening. So he sacrifices the g-pawn so that he can get his bishop over in time to stop the pawn. But now white's king can come forward. It comes forward with tempo again because it's attacking the bishop. Bishop goes here, and the king goes to g5. And at this point, he finally resigns. If the king, for example, were to go after this backwards pawn here, there's this nice move, a bishop check, forcing an exchange of bishops, and then this pawn will queen. So there's no way he can stop all of the threats. If he doesn't go after this pawn, white is just going to come over here with his king, chase this bishop away, or force it to be traded for the h-pawn, and then queen with this pawn. So that's game over, and he resigned in this position. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thought it was a pretty nice example of Smyslov's play. I've seen some of his games that weren't that impressive, so it's nice to see him play some tactical ideas here. I enjoyed it. Leave any comments you have in the section below. Oh, before I go on with that, the standings on the tournament. So Smyslov won. Reshevsky won his game as well. So they're still the number 1 and 2 players. After 18 rounds, Smyslov has 11.5 points. Reshevsky has 10.5 points, so he's a point behind. Half point further back is Bronstein with 10 points, and Nydorf with 9.5 points. So those are the 4 leaders of the tournament after 18 rounds. And stay tuned for coverage of future rounds. See you then. Bye.